It's done when it's done. As Chris Roberts rightly pointed out, these are famous words when it comes to video games and have been used more than once by some of the best studios out there. They have more than once led to some amazing games throughout the decades, and many of these titles have been extremely memorable and are now considered classics and great examples of pushing technology, story and possibilities. But when does this become too long and too much? The story has been well told by now. Star Citizen and Squadron 42 were announced way back in 2012 to a massively successful crowdfunding campaign. At the time, Chris Roberts stated that development on the game had already been worked on for a year by the time the Kickstarter campaign went live. These massive space games then are now 9 years into their development timeline, or 8 years if you want to count purely from the Kickstarter date. Now this is a massive amount of time by any standards. Keep in mind that in 2012, people were still playing on the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. Xbox One and PlayStation 4 were not released until late 2013. In short then, Squadron 42 has so far been in development for an entire console generation with still no sign of a release date in sight. Now, a number of people out there will quite rightly and quite reasonably be pointing out that game development for industry-defining and industry-changing titles does indeed take a lot of time. There's no shortcut to achieving those types of goals. Now, when someone sets their sights on targeting something that has never been attempted before, then it's reasonable to expect that this will indeed take a long time and take a lot of money. It's actually worth taking a step back here. In 2012, the games industry was a very different place. Mobile gaming was on the rise, PC gaming had, to an extent at least, stagnated, and the consoles were in many ways, although not entirely, producing a lot of generic games. So this was a situation that Chris Roberts wanted to directly challenge, and Star Citizen and Squadron 42 were the answer to this, and this very premise was what the campaign for the early foundations of the financial success were built upon and the initial Kickstarter. This video then isn't about the tech behind Squadron 42, it's not about roadmaps or features, it's not even really about delays. The focus instead is on what Chris Roberts himself was focusing on in 2012, which he discussed many times during the Kickstarter period and thereafter, and that is the games industry itself and its then at the time limitations which Squadron 42 promised to directly address. Over the past 8 years, whilst Squadron 42 has been in development, the gaming industry has undergone more than a few seismic shifts, both in terms of technology as well as the type of games that are now being produced. Now, I don't want to focus so much on the hardware technology in this video as it's about games, so let's take a look at the games. The whole realm of what is and isn't possible with video games in terms of stories has dramatically changed over the past decade. Squadron 42, of course, continues to promise an amazing in-depth story, told in an immersive manner with direct player involvement. It's a commendable approach and something I look forward to seeing. Over the past years, numerous titles have now shown what is indeed possible. In 2015, we saw the release of what many people claim is among the best games of all time, The Witcher 3. It's a testament to the game that the central protagonist of the game, Geralt, is now considered an iconic character. The game is now 5.5 years old, yet at the time it represented a dramatic shift in single-player storytelling, and even today it can easily stand against the most modern titles. As industry-shaking as the game that Witcher 3 was, it took CD Projekt Red around 4 years to develop from start to finish. Red Dead Redemption 2 arrived in late 2018 and marked another massive single-player game. This game, perhaps more than any other, dropped players in a world that could quite easily be considered a massive sandbox, whilst at the same time allowing players to approach elements in various different ways during a dedicated story. In fact, Red Dead Redemption 2 is a good example to use here. In a most recent episode of The Briefing Room, that's a new series dedicated directly to the development of Squadron 42, CIG discussed how they are attempting to give a sandbox-like approach to the story. They want players to be able to approach situations in different ways. This seems to be a high priority for them, and this is actually a very good thing because here in 2020, this is something that has largely become expected for all of the biggest single-player story-driven games. In short, it's kind of a minimum requirement at this point. Now, Red Dead Redemption 2 wasn't an easy title to build by all accounts. It took around 7 years to develop, and that's keeping in mind that Rockstar already had a huge chunk of the technology they used to build the game. Now, if we move away somewhat from open-world single-player story-driven titles and instead look on linear single-player games, the gaming industry has shifted dramatically since 2012. The PlayStation 4 and Xbox One opened up entirely new realms of what was possible compared to the older consoles. Horizon Zero Dawn, Uncharted 4, God of War, Death Stranding, The Last of Us 2 are all titles that achieved something that had never been done before. Chris Roberts then is very right to point to these titles when he uses examples of the best games ever produced that were only done when they were done. Many of these even experienced delays in their development, albeit delays of months rather than years. I think it's also very fair to point out that each of these studios behind the titles were already built on a great caliber of developer. These companies had proven themselves again and again, and had more than earned the right to feel that a title was done when it was done. And perhaps more than that, they followed through and delivered genre-defining experiences. Now, elsewhere, over the previous few years, the space game genre has certainly come very much back to life, and these perhaps are more related to Squadron 42 in some ways. Arguably, perhaps one of the freelancer-styled clones released in the form of Rebel Galaxy Outlaw, whilst EA themselves went out and revived the classic X-Wing and TIE Fighter format in the form of Star Wars Squadrons. Heck, even Call of Duty attempted space-based storytelling in 2016 with Infinite Warfare, and of course the Outer Worlds and the Outer Wilds also took the space-themed genre to new places. Before I go any further here, the comparisons I've used here are certainly not intended to undermine what Squadron 42 is trying to achieve. Far from it, in fact. What I'm actually trying to illustrate here is just how much the world of massive single-player games has changed over the last 8 years. Not only have consoles taken the world by storm with delivering games and stories that were once not possible, but companies are also willing to take risks on the PC, a platform which, in 2012, Chris Roberts considered to be dead. For example, in his Rock Paper Shotgun interview in 2013, Chris Roberts pointed out that people were still at that point asking for Half-Life 3 many years after the release of Half-Life 2. And here we are in 2020 and people are still doing exactly the same. Yet the fact remains that over this time, Valve did go ahead and deliver a brand new Half-Life game. Not only was it exclusive to PCs, but it also was exclusive to a niche platform, VR. Half-Life Alyx then was a huge undertaking for Valve. It again shifted what was possible with gaming technology and is now easily the single best example of what is possible with games when using VR. And not only did it open up the possibilities for VR tech, but it also offered a deeply impressive single-player story-driven game that puts players right inside the story. Literally. Half-Life Alyx then is perhaps one of the top games of the decade that not only attempts, but also far surpasses in achieving something that had never been done before. What's more, the evolution of the single-player gaming industry shows no signs of slowing down. The new console generation is right around the corner, and the next few years will undoubtedly see similar gaming advances that we saw over the previous 8 years. Next month, we'll finally see the release of Cyberpunk 2077, twice delayed but likely well worth the wait. It's clear at this point that the game world itself within Cyberpunk 2077 will likely be the star of the show. Although not entirely content with that, CD Projekt Red have perhaps one of the most recognisable actors on the planet with Keanu Reeves. Beyond that though, the focus of any single-player story-driven world is the story itself. This is very clearly a huge focus for Squadron 42, just as it rightly should be, and Chris Roberts has talked about the writing involved for the gameplay many times. This is also a subject that CD Projekt Red understand very well, revealing their lengthy script in a tweet not so long ago. Cyberpunk 2077 has also turned out to be an expensive game to produce, and one which has been in development for a long while now. Earlier this year, CD Projekt Red announced they had spent $121 million on the game, along with other projects. And these other projects also include the likes of the next as yet unannounced Witcher game. So their spending is certainly high, but what they are delivering here is multiple games, and industry-defining games at that. Of course, Cyberpunk 2077 is far from where this evolution in gaming will end. Whilst currently in development limbo, Dying Light 2 promises a huge shift for single-player story-driven games. Meanwhile, Starfield is likely inching closer and closer, and at this point might even beat Squadron 42 to your PC. So then, all of this really does bring me back to the question that I opened with. When does development time become too long and too much? Well, it really does seem to me that the games industry itself has answered this very question over the last 8 years. In 2012, many people felt that PC gaming was dead, that the space game genre was gone, that consoles couldn't achieve anything especially unique. Squadron 42 and Star Citizen promised to change that. Yet over the better part of the previous decade, the situation has completely and dramatically changed. Now we have multiple games released per year that each achieve something that has never been done before. We have compelling single-player stories that are very well written and place the player in central focus, sometimes, in the case of the Half-Life Alyx, very literally. Often these stories have a semi-sandbox nature to them, allowing players immense freedom. And in the case of more linear games, the games themselves are extremely compelling technical achievements with great stories. And further, there's been huge chunks of gaming technology developed to deliver all of this. For me then, the bottom line for Squadron 42 is very simple. Is Squadron 42 now stuck in a development loop? After all, it has a lot of promises to live up to, and over the years other games have advanced what is possible, each time shifting the goalpost of what it means to be great. Could it perhaps be a case then that Squadron 42 is constantly stuck in a loop of being beaten to new advances in gaming tech, which in turn force CIG to scope creep and push back dates to meet these new lofty goals? With the next generation of consoles and PC hardware now here, gaming tech is only going to improve. What then does this mean for Squadron 42?